It's a wonderful honor to welcome Professor Henry Clark of Dartmouth College on this program once again. The last time he was on this program, we discussed the French intellect, Montesquieu, and this time he recently published a new book titled The Moral Economy We Have Lost: Life Before Mass Abundance. Henry, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm just great, Chuang. Thank you very much for having me. I suppose I should explain before we begin our conversation the reason for these sunglasses. I'm here straight from cataract surgery, so I'm not quite seeing in my usual way, but I'll do my best to carry on.
Okay, well, wonderful. So let's begin by the historian E.P. Thompson and the phrase moral economy. Tell me a little bit about either of these.
Oh, well, yes. It's an excellent question, and in fact, it is really the beginning of the project that I've undertaken. E.P. Thompson wrote an article in 1971 in Past and Present magazine entitled "The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th Century." Now, before 1971, the phrase moral economy did not have any particular purchase. It was used infrequently, for one thing, and it was used informally and non-technically as well. But after 1971, after the appearance of Thompson's article, the phrase moral economy came to mean something quite specific. It went, as we say today, it went viral. And in fact, according to Google Ngram, the phrase is used today in excess of 30 times as often as it was used in 1970, the year before his article appeared. And so it has a specific purchase and has specific tendencies. And it has become, in fact, an important heuristic, not only, I would say, for the social historians for whom it was aimed in Thompson's original article, but I would argue that the notion of a moral economy has become more widely available beyond mere social historians. I find in my own experience when I walk into a room with humanities faculty or social science faculty, a significant number of them know who E.P. Thompson is, even if they are not historians, and a not insignificant number of them know what the notion of a moral economy is. E.P. Thompson was one of the most influential historians of the post-war period. There was a survey of historians a few years ago that found that among historians, he is regarded as the second most influential of the post-war period, second only to Brodel, a figure that I'm sure you're familiar with also, the co-founder of the Annales School in France. And so for all of these reasons, I thought that starting with E.P. Thompson's notion of the moral economy would be a good place to start for my project. So for Thompson, the phrase moral economy referred to at first at least, he wanted it to refer to a specific time, a specific place, a specific kind of social action. The title of his essay again was "The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th Century." And I think he was attempting to accomplish a number of different things with this essay. One is he was attempting to reinterpret a widely known phenomenon, the phenomenon of the food riot, in a fashion that was going to be more sympathetic to the food rioters themselves than the kind of picture that he saw in what he regarded as the then hegemonic view of 18th century food rioters, namely the one presented in the work of economists or economic historians. In fact, a not insignificant part of the project, of his project, was to reassert the centrality of a social history way of thinking about crowd action and to diminish the influence of economic historians whom he thought, or who he thought, had tended to regard food rioters simply as little more than either ignorant, hungry people or mischievous brigands, vandals, and otherwise socially destructive sorts of people. And so what he did was he asserted the food riot itself as a distinct social practice with its own rules, its own norms, its own expectations, and its own quite rational goals. And the goals were far more elevated, far more dignified, far more worthy of our respect than mere brigandage or vandalism. They were in his perception, they were ultimately and primarily designed to assert a certain moral vision at the heart of a day-to-day kind of economic activity in the villages and hamlets of pre-industrial Europe, and especially 18th century England. And the way in which that is supposed to have happened is that the food rioters themselves were hearkening to an ethos of solidarity, of mutual respect and mutual care, mutual concern, an ethos of face-to-face personal reciprocity, which on the one hand, Thompson saw as having been embedded in statutes, actual laws in England going way back, Tudor legislation from the late 16th or early 17th century. But on the other hand, they also evoked a kind of autarkic, autonomous, independent, local economic life, a life in which bread, for an example, which is what most of the food rioters were all about, bread being the staple of common people in the 18th century, would be regarded in some sense as a shared good, a public good, we would say today, rather than simply an item of commerce. This vision of what the food rioters were about, he saw as being infused with moral ideas and moral ideals, and he contrasted this picture of food rioting against what he viewed as the encroachment, the increasingly aggressive but still alien encroachment into village and hamlet life of what he calls at one point a kind of amoral view of economic life, which was emerging in political economy, an entirely new discourse of the 18th century, typified in his view by Adam Smith, culminating in a way in Adam Smith, according to which the markets are morally neutral. They have no particular moral content to them themselves. Bread is nothing special. It's simply an article of commerce in just the way that wheelbarrows or widgets might be. And as such, The real moral obligation of modern people is simply to accept the dictates of nature, which is what this new political economy claimed to be based on, and to live within its constraints. So it was this fairly sharp contrast, and made sharper by those who came after him than by Thomson himself, who was an extraordinarily subtle and careful stylist, among other things. He was a truly gifted historian. But even in Thomson himself, there is this relatively clear dichotomy between the moral economy of the food rioters and of traditional attitudes towards bread and towards trade of any kind, on the one hand, and the emergence of political economy on the other hand.
I see.
So that I think is what I would say by way of just very, very general description of who Thomson was and what this particular idea of his was. And it's the starting point for my book. As you know from having looked at the book, it's clear you have looked at the book since you asked an excellent question. The real purpose of my book is to offer an alternative way of thinking about the moral economy of pre-industrial, not just 18th century, but pre-industrial, going back to the 12th century, from the 12th through the 18th century, broadly speaking. A different way of thinking about what a real moral economy might have been experienced as in Northwest Europe in particular, Western Europe in general, during that period, for a variety of different reasons that we can perhaps get into as we go forward.
Mhm. Okay. So, what kinds of conversations or discussions do you hope that the book will spark in, say, this year, 2024, or the next few years?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot, as you can imagine. I think that the book could spark a number of different conversations in a number of different disciplines. Obviously, first and foremost, in the discipline of social history. One of the conversations that I'd like to provoke concerns the following very simple question. How much economic thinking, how much economic reasoning, how much economic logic or economic literacy should a good practicing social historian try to have in order to understand the conduct that social actors, that social historians tend to be interested in, which means for the most part, common people, ordinary people, not elites, not nobles, not kings and princes, but ordinary people. That's the remit, the traditional remit of social history. How much economic logic should be incorporated into the work of social historians? It was, as I mentioned, a part, not necessarily the fundamental part, but I think an important part of Thomson's original enterprise to redraw the boundary line and redress the balance between economic thinking on the one hand, the thinking of economists and economic historians, and that of social history on the other hand. I believe that since his time, since he wrote that essay in 1971, there has been a tendency from time to time, more pronounced at some times than at others, but certainly pronounced throughout, on the part of social historians to regard economists and economics in general in an almost adversarial kind of way. You very often hear not just social historians, but many other people in many disciplines complain about the imperial reach of economics, the way in which economics has now attempted to encroach upon the domains of sociology and history and many other fields by incorporating economic paradigms and economic questions in everything from crime and punishment to sex and family life to religion. It's all now been taken over, according to some people, by economics. I am sympathetic to any claim or any complaint about disciplinary imperialism. So there's a part of me that is sympathetic to this sort of complaint. But I also think that, generally speaking, it goes too far in many cases, and that good social history today will at least be aware of some salient economic dimensions to the subject that they are addressing, and that they can improve the quality of their own research and writing by showing somewhat more openness to these sorts of economic types of logic. To take one example, economics is the discipline of scarcity. Scarcity is all about making very careful and indeed even existential forms of cost-benefit analysis. The use of scarce resources in human enterprises of one kind or another is something that economists deal with every day. And I think that social historians can profitably take on board the economists' awareness of scarcity and of cost benefit. There's an old saying. Thomas Sowell is, I suppose, one of the more recent people to articulate it in his usual lucid and pithy way. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. I sometimes think that social historians treat their subjects as if, having diagnosed the existence of a problem and having shown a failure of this or that group, this or that society, this or that ruling elite to solve the problem, that they have then accomplished a really important goal, which in many cases they have. But in other cases, it's best to be mindful of the constraints and limits under which past people were operating. For example, one criticism that might be made of Thompson's own work, and it's a criticism that applies to the entire pre-industrial period, is that before the great breakthroughs of the middle of the 19th century, which we often summarize by the phrase the Industrial Revolution, humans, certainly including the English, certainly including Europe and the Western world, were living in an essentially organic economy. And in retrospect, it certainly looks as if the organic character of pre-industrial life imposed tremendous limitations and constraints upon what any society or any regime might conceivably have been able to do in order to address the suffering of the people who lived during those times. The difference between an organic economy where motive power, energy, all of it was limited by the very severe limits of organic nature, animal husbandry and such, I was bound to impose severe limits on the human solution of what are today regarded as real problems. There is another. I mean, the answer to your question, Trong, is it can go on and on because it's an excellent question, and we could speak for hours about it. I'll just mention one other sort of conversation that I envision may arise from my book is to revisit again the question of the relationship between violence on the one hand and human progress on the other. Thompson was, of course, a Marxist. He was a member of the British Communist Party for quite a long time, into the 1950s. And even after he took some distance from his party commitments, he nonetheless subscribed to a view which is on full display in the Moral Economy essay, the 1971 essay, which is that human progress usually comes, or at least very often comes, either from concerted direct action up to and including violence, or from the credible threat of concerted and direct action by mobilized classes of people. At one point in his essay, he remarks that the food riots of the 18th century created an arena for class conflict that was not dramatically different in kind from the class conflict that, in his view, defined life in the industrial domain, the new factories and mills of the 19th century. And so the gift of theory that Thompson and others of his school wanted to impart to ordinary people was a theory that would lead to direct action that would dramatically and fundamentally address problems that they faced and overcome fundamental obstacles to their human flourishing, and that would lead to a kind of an overall human progress. Well, here again, I think there are two general points that can be made. I make them both at various points in my book that at least question this model of human progress. One is, how progressive were the food riots of the 18th century? How much progress did the existence of them or the threat of them actually contribute to? And I won't go into the detail, but suffice it to say that I think it's a real question. How much genuine improvement was or could have been brought about by the, after all, hundreds of riots. They haven't even been fully counted yet. There's a database that is in progress now that is attempting to accumulate and quantify the scale of food riots, not only in England, but throughout Europe. But there were certainly hundreds in England just in the 18th century alone. There were thousands throughout Europe, going back as far as records go into the Middle Ages. So how much positive change, how much positive progress was or could have been expected from that quarter in the way that Thompson seems to have thought was the case? That's one question. Conversely, if we ask ourselves whether those ordinary people whose lives he wanted, admirably in my view, to validate and to bring to the fore and to bring to our attention ordinary laborers, ordinary artisans, ordinary consumers of bread in local villages and hamlets. If we ask how they, if their food riots did not contribute as much to human progress as Thompson thought that they did, the corollary question might be, well, does that mean that they contributed in no way at all to a human progress? And here again, I would note that economic historians have provided some ammunition that might be useful for social historians for thinking about ways in which ordinary laborers, journeymen, apprentices, guild artisans, outworkers, cottage industry workers, all kinds of categories of ordinary laborers might have contributed to human progress, including contributing to the great breakthrough itself that occurred with the rise of an industrial economy in the 18th and 19th century. There's been a lot of work on this lately, and although its results remain, in my view, inconclusive, they are at the very least suggestive, and they are a way of both validating ordinary people, which was the essential, I think it was really the essential aspiration that Thompson had in mind with his work, but doing so in a way that emphasizes not their mobilization into phalanxes of solidarity and disciplined rioting or threats of rioting, but rather through the very channels and means by which their labor was used in the society itself. So there have been some cross-cultural studies of apprenticeship, let's say, in the West versus the rest, or journeyman laborers, and the ways in which the journeyman experience in Europe, especially Northwest Europe, Germany, France, England, might have contributed to the development of what we today call human capital, or skills, basically, industrial skills, and so forth through the rest of the categories I mentioned, including even the contested question of the guilds. You know, the guilds is perhaps one of the oldest, maybe the oldest controversy in the whole literature on the emergence of a modern economy. Adam Smith, of course, went on and on about them, and we all know how little he thought of them. You're thinking of them as a conspiracy against the public and so forth and so on. There's a fair amount of revisionist work, primarily by economic historians. Some social historians have entered the fray as well, that brings a more nuanced picture to the guilds, and that shows how the way in which the guilds functioned in the West may have been significantly different from the way in which the guilds in the Ottoman Empire, the guilds in India, or comparable institutions, at least, in India or the Ottoman Empire or China function. So those are a couple of answers to your question. About what kinds of conversations would I like to see? If you'll permit me one more, I would like to see a conversation about how far it is appropriate to incorporate particularly results from decision theory or behavioral economics or psychology, whatever you might want to call it, into our understanding of the past. As you know from looking at my book, I attempt to do that. And I do that primarily because if we're going to think theoretically about the experiences of food rioters in 18th century England, I believe that the results from decision theory, and my students are familiar with a lot of the terminology from decision theory that I use sparingly, I hope, in the book, the availability heuristic, the endowment effect, the intentionality bias. Sowell himself uses the phrase the physical fallacy. There's a number of loss aversion, risk aversion, things of that sort. There are a number of different ideas that 21st century behavioral science, which of course was not available to Thompson. We can't criticize him for not incorporating these ideas into his own work, but they are now a part of our mental equipment. I believe that they are and should be part of the common parlance of humankind. And I believe that they cast an entirely different light on what the food rioters of the 18th century were doing, what they could possibly have been doing, and how they perceived or seemed to have perceived the economic world around them. Let me put this point in a somewhat simpler and more general way. I think that there is generally recognized to be a tension, and has been from the beginning, from Tocqueville and before, a tension between two of the great overarching commitments of the modern world, and that is liberalism and democracy. So the article of faith in a liberal democracy is that ordinary people can make wise enough judgments about their rulers to choose people who will adopt wise policies. Well, that's a wonderful thing. It is a stirring thing. It's a commitment that I subscribe to 100% with every fiber of my being. But it is a tangled and contentious thing, precisely because the nature of the world that we live in today, the nature of the societies that ordinary people like you and me, among other things, live in today, is so fiendishly complex that it's a real stretch to believe that ordinary people are going to always and everywhere make wise judgments about who's going to have the best policy for, let's say, artificial intelligence or any other sort of futuristic, highly technical topic that you might imagine. And so somehow there has to be a great deal of faith. We have to have faith that ordinary people are going to make good faith judgments when they go into the polling place. They're going to use the actual information and knowledge and wisdom available to them rather than casting their votes on the basis of vibes, and that they're going to have some sort of ways of informing themselves, some sorts of shortcuts for informing themselves about the big issues that ideally they would know about in making their choices of rulers. And one of those topics is simply economics itself. One of the things that has happened in the last decade or so, in particular, although it really goes back at least to the 1990s that I'm aware of, is that economists themselves have become more and more attuned to the great gulf between what economists generally agreed to be true and what ordinary people very often assume to be true, whether the topic is tariffs or price gouging laws or rent control. I mention a number of them in the conclusion to this book, but we could all add up our own list of topics on which economists, who are famous for not agreeing among themselves about anything, will nonetheless almost unanimously agree, tariffs are going to have this kind of effect. Rent controls are bad for X, Y, and Z reason. Price gouging laws are flawed for this, that, and the other reason. Most economists will agree on these propositions, and yet they continue to be exceedingly popular among ordinary people. And so I think it's simply a perennial challenge. I don't look upon it as an urgent crisis, but it's a continual challenge in 2024, as it has been for decades and generations even, to figure out a way to synthesize and combine the commitments that we have to liberalism, that is to say, to allowing people to live the kinds of lives that they want to live as unmolested by others as possible, including in the economic domain, and democracy, on the other hand, which is the proposition that all of us as ordinary people are best situated to choose wise governance. I don't have to tell you that there has for centuries been, and there continues to be in 2024, a revival, in fact, in 2024, of admiration for the sheer directness, the sheer linear purposefulness of authoritarian governments, the sheer ability to take action quickly on a problem after an elite cadre of experts has identified that problem. I think there's a part of all of us, even those of us who are most attached to liberal democracy, to kind of admire the sheer, the energy in the executive. That's the phrase that Hamilton used when he was writing the Federalist Papers with Madison and Jay. And I think we all sort of respond to that. But a continuing challenge is combining economics with economic liberalism with political democracy. And I hope that my book contributes in some small way to a kind of a revisiting of that sort of issue as well. We could go on and on about this. It's a great question, but I think there are a lot of different conversations that will emerge out of this book.
Mhm. I'm reminded of a quotation that Edmund Burke wrote in his reflections on the French Revolution. He said, "The age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever." I mean, you gotta love his rhetoric. He's one of the few great rhetoricians of Western philosophical thought. Nevertheless, I think a theme that I detected in your book is how a modern economy has disrupted or even destroyed certain traditional patterns of commerce or human relationships. And I think that's a very relevant factor to account for today. So what can we learn from these disruptions caused by mass abundance, as the title of your book suggests?
Well, the first thing I would say, it's a great question again, Chuang. You're really firing on all cylinders today. The first thing that I would say is that it's easy to exaggerate the extent to which it was mass abundance itself, or it was, as Burke said, the economists and sophisters themselves who brought this kind of demystification to social life. Marx made a similar sort of critique, and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, when they talked about how bourgeois society had ripped the veil off of all that had been sacred and honorable in the past, and had reduced everything to a cash nexus. So I think the first thing I would say about that is for us to guard against the temptation to exaggerate the demystifying, the disenchantment, as Weber called it, of the world that was brought about by the supposed rise of capitalism. One of the things that historians have discovered in recent decades is that actually, long before the 18th century, long before the 19th century, ordinary people whom we had normally thought of as warmly and cozily embedded in traditional, loving structures of mutual reciprocity, direct face-to-face reciprocity, as Thompson called it, and the warm, the cozy cosmos view of village life. You often get that picture from looking at some of the 16th century painters. You know, for a good 50 years, practically from the time of Thompson himself, historians have discovered, when they've actually looked closely at this warm sense of solidarity, this collectivistic culture as opposed to the individualistic culture of 19th century capitalism, that, well, actually, there was a fair amount, in fact, a great deal of economic individualism and other kinds of individualism in at least many parts of Europe, perhaps not all, Northwest Europe in particular, going back many centuries. One of the very first sallies or salvos in this particular line of scholarly thinking appeared in 1978, I believe it was, 77 or 78, with the appearance of Alan McFarlane's book, The Origins of English Individualism. And instead of tracing individualism to the 19th century factory, as a lot of historians of the family had done, thinking that the normal family was an extended family until the Industrial Revolution came along and eroded those bonds of extended family and left people at sea in the anonymous, impersonal cities that they had to move to in order to find work. What McFarlane found, first in that book and then in a number of other books that came afterwards, is that the true origins of English individualism are to be found in the 13th century and perhaps even earlier. In that first book, Origins of English Individualism, he focused on landed property, and he showed how a fair amount, not all, but a significant amount of landed property in 13th century England was subject to the kind of buying and selling activities that you and I might expect in the 21st century. When we get out the for sale ads in the newspaper, and we just kind of very coldly and calculatedly look and see what's for sale. In later books, McFarlane looked at other aspects of this subject. He has a book on sex and family life, where he argues that a similar phenomenon of individualism, that is to say, individual decisions about family formation or household formation, made in the context of the nuclear family, it too is not a product of 19th century industrialism. It's found back in the 13th century, and so forth. Now, one thing that Alan did in his work is he put a great deal of emphasis upon England, on English exceptionalism. That particular aspect of his project has been criticized and has fallen by the wayside among most recent scholars. But what they've instead done is they've expanded the geographical scope of his essential insight. And they have discovered that the kind of individualism that he wrote about is found in multiple different kinds of ways in other parts of Europe, mostly in Northwest Europe. And I have a chapter, as you probably noticed, chapter 6 on the European marriage pattern, which I think if you were to ask me, so what are the 5 most significant actual discoveries that historical research has made in the past 60 years or so, I might very well put the discovery of the European marriage pattern on that list. It's such a significant finding. It was a finding that occurred in the 1960s. It was an Anglo-Hungarian demographer who made the essential discoveries, but a great deal of work has been done since then. And even more recently, the work of Joe Henrich at Harvard, the cultural anthropologist, the evolutionary anthropologist at Harvard University, and his entire lab have doubled down on the idea of the European marriage pattern and have argued that there was a very specific mechanism to explain why it appeared when and where it did, and to argue that it began to appear very early indeed. Henrich traces it back to the 6th or 7th century. So what do I mean by European marriage pattern? I don't know that I've explained that yet. Simply the pattern that in brief outline, it's the pattern that you and I are familiar with. Nuclear households, male and female, both enter into the union voluntarily. They are accordingly very likely to be at or near the same age. They are a nuclear household. And they are likely to have children as and when they want to, rather than as part of a broader tribal or clan-like family strategy, and so forth and so on. So the idea, just to take this one example of family life, the idea that the rise of industrial capitalism has eroded traditional, warmer institutions and customs of human connectedness is much harder to maintain today, I would say, than it was before the discovery and robust validation, I would say, of the theory of the European marriage pattern, or the Western family and marriage program, is what Henrich himself and his team call it in recent years. So that's one thing I would say. Now the other thing, of course, I would have to acknowledge that yes, there are multiple problems that we today face that we would probably not be facing in the absence of the kind of mass abundance that we experience. There was a Pew Research Center report 4 years ago, March of 2020. It did not get much attention because March of 2020, all of a sudden people had other things on their mind. But what it showed was extraordinarily high levels of reporting of having been told by a mental health professional that you have a mental health condition. It's not 5%, it's not 10%. It's in the vicinity of near or even more than half of some populations. It's divided, the study is divided, of course, by age, by sex, and also by political affiliation, interestingly enough. And there are many other studies that find similar sorts of things, that there are real problems that seem to be associated with various aspects of what we think of as modern life. on this side of the Atlantic, I'll just tell you, and you probably already know this, one of the viral books of the spring and summer was Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which is all about this very problem. And of course, what John does is he hones in on one specific mechanism at one specific point of time. It's a subtle book, and it's a very good book, but he really focuses on the role of social media, which is a somewhat more controversial claim on his part, or set of claims on his part. But social media is a perfect example of a product of an extraordinary abundance of our economic lives that nonetheless can legitimately be seen as bringing untold amounts of anxiety and needless mental upset of various kinds. I won't try and speak like a psychologist, that would not have existed in pre-industrial life. However, were the people who were making allegations of witchcraft, were they mentally healthy people? Were they not alienated in some way? What does the term alienation exactly mean? One of the purposes of my book is to foster rethinking of that kind about what the actual mental consequences were likely to be of living in the kind of Malthusian conditions that our ancestors, and I focus in the book, as you know, on Europe, but I'm certain that that similar studies would find similar results in India and China and throughout Eurasia, if not beyond. So that's how I would answer that question. Yes, there are problems that are distinctive of our own time and our own level of abundance, but it has been way too easy for critics of capitalism to imagine that these problems did not exist before the rise of capitalism itself. And what I want to do is I want to provide the basis for much more careful thinking about the actual costs and benefits, the actual constraints and incentives that were faced by people in pre-industrial Malthusian kinds of economies, so that we can think more clearly in a more precise way about the problems that we face today.
I see. Okay, so I'd like to end on this note. So we are facing an election year, at least you are in the United States. How much should the average American voter know about the economy that she lives in?
Well, that's a rather big question to end on, and I guess one way of thinking about it is, if you still believe that James Carville had it right back in the election campaign of 1992, he was Bill Clinton's chief political advisor, and the little motto that he had on the desk was, "It's the economy, stupid." So that would seem to suggest people ought to know a lot about the economy. I would say this. I would say that a conscientious citizen, a conscientious voter, would be someone who takes seriously the economic effects of this or that candidate, not just for their own narrow economic interests, but for the economy, for the society as a whole. And that one of the themes that I discuss in my book is the ways in which the expanding circles of commerce from the 12th or 13th century out into the 18th century and beyond created more of a sense, a keener sense of reciprocities that transcended the face-to-face reciprocities that E.P. Thompson was so concerned about, replacing those not with selfishness and greed, but with expanding circles of reciprocity, first inter-village or inter-urban reciprocities, even in times of food shortage. And beyond that, broader reciprocities as well, and embracing the public interest of the whole society, and ideally, of course, the global society as well. So I would say that each citizen would do well to learn enough about each of these different levels of our connectedness to a broader global economy to be able to make informed decisions about their candidate choice, keeping those factors in mind.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Professor Henry Clark, for joining the show. And of course, I wish you get well soon with your vision issues at the moment.
Thanks very much, Truong, and thank you for having me on too. It's always a pleasure. Bye bye now.